Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing Good Samaritan laws and an upcoming case at the Supreme Court of Canada. The Federal Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act provides some legal protections for people who experience or witness someone else having a drug overdose. If someone witnesses an overdose and calls 911, the Good Samaritan law can protect them from charges of simple drug possession or breach of drug possession conditions for things like probation and parole. This type of protection is important because it's often other drug users who witness an overdose. If they're vulnerable to arrest, if they call in an overdose, they're going to be less likely to call for help. Police have credited the Good Samaritan law with an increase in 911 calls for overdoses. But the Good Samaritan law doesn't provide legal protection for people who call 911 but have committed other more serious offenses, like if they have an outstanding warrant for their arrest, if they're involved in the production of drugs or trafficking of drugs, or if they are engaged in other more serious crimes. This carve out to the Good Samaritan law is now going to be considered by the Supreme Court in a case called R.V. Wilson. In that case, Wilson called in a drug overdose that he witnessed, and he was then himself arrested for drug possession. Following a search at the time of that arrest, he was arrested a second time, but this time for the more serious offenses of trafficking and firearms possessions. Here today to discuss this are two experts, Kabir Sharma, a criminal lawyer, and Osgoode criminal law professor, Lisa Dufraimont. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Lisa, before we talk about the specific case involving Mr. Wilson, maybe I did a high level explanation of how the Good Samaritan law works. Is there anything you want to add to expanding on how this law actually functions in practice?
Yeah, so I guess I would just start with the idea that, of course, it's an offense to possess illegal drugs like heroin or cocaine. So normally, police could charge a person found in possession of drugs. But the Good Samaritan law applies when first responders arrive, they're helping in a medical emergency, usually a drug overdose. And the law says that if police discover evidence that people at the scene of an overdose are in possession of drugs, those people cannot be charged with or convicted of the offense. So it doesn't say it's not an offense. It says those people can't be charged with or convicted with the offense. And the last thing I'd say is that the people it covers are the person who called for help, as well as any other people who stayed at the scene, and even the person who's experiencing the overdose.
Kabir, is there anything you want to add to how you view this law, how it functions on the ground?
So, as a criminal defense lawyer, surprisingly, it does not come up that often, but I think there's a very valid explanation for that. I think that there has been recently a social movement to no longer stigmatize or punish people who are vulnerable and who are addicted to substances. So, I think what happens on the road is that police officers, when they're responding to certain issues with respect to overdoses and find people in possession of drugs, they exercise their discretion to then not charge or arrest that individual who's in possession of those drugs. I think as a result of that, it's not often that cases that result in simple possession are put before the court in general. And that's why stuff like this or charges like this doesn't come up that often with respect to the practical criminal law practice.
Right. That's an interesting point. Now, Lisa, I said in the opening that police have credited this Good Samaritan law with what they say is an increase in calls for to 911 for overdoses. Do you know if there any evidence to back up that claim by police? Have you heard that? Do you think it has resulted in an increase in calls for help?
Well, I've heard that, and I understand that some police, in their own experience in the jurisdictions that they're operating in, say that there's been an increase in calls. Now, of course, an increase in calls doesn't necessarily result from the law. An increase in calls could also, unfortunately, be because there are more drugs on the street. So it's
And
hard to
and more
separate.
toxic drugs, right? Like
Right, and more
drugs. What
exactly
I've
that
heard
the
is
drugs.
the toxicity of drugs, of like fentanyl, is much higher.
Exactly. So that there could be other matters involved here in terms of increasing the number of calls. And also, of course, people who use drugs are a difficult population to study. So it's hard to do this research and to actually know for sure whether it's increasing calls. And so I think the jury is still out on that.
Kabir, is anything you want to add there? Do you think that this law has resulted in an increase, or do you think it's kind of hard to know? We've only got about 30 seconds.
I think that ultimately it hasn't at least in my personal experience, dealing with individuals who are in the drug subculture, they still feel that fear with calling 911 and trying to
Yeah.
assist somebody with an overdose because they
Yeah.
feel that they don't have the trust in the
Yeah.
police that is required.
We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back.